Today, what we want to get into is the biblical concept of what is a prophet. Now, in the lessons before this one, you've been going through the Deuteronomistic history, which is also known as the former prophets. And I've briefly alluded to the idea that prophets in the Bible are the people who tell you what you're doing wrong. And how to fix that or what you need to do better. And so as we transition from the former prophets to what are now known as the latter prophets, we'll now get into this idea of what exactly is a prophet, what does a prophet do? So we transition from the former prophets, which is also known as the Deuteronomistic history, to now the latter prophets, which are the books that are specifically about individual prophets like Amos, Isaiah, Hosea, Ezekiel, people like that. So what I want you to get out of today's short lecture and lesson and assignment that you're going to do after this is be able to define what a prophet is. That's easy. What does a prophet do? And then what do we mean by this term widows and orphans? So let's get into it. The first thing we need to understand about a prophet is that a prophet does more than just predict the future. Is that part of what they do? Yes, absolutely. But they do a lot more than just predict the future. There are a lot of different words that are used to describe the prophets in the Old Testament, but the most common, most frequently used word is the Hebrew word Navi. Now, I don't expect you to learn the Hebrew word here for the test, but I would like you to understand what it means. A Navi is one who speaks for God. At the most basic level, the job of the prophet, or what defines somebody as a prophet, is simply one who speaks for God. That's it. That's what makes somebody a prophet in a lot of ways. One who speaks for God. Now, what does a prophet speak about, though? What kinds of things do they talk about? What we have on this slide here is not meant to be a comprehensive list of everything that you will find in the Old Testament prophets, but it does give us a representative sample of what the prophets typically speak about. Now, the first thing I want you to understand here is that to be a prophet, you do not, I'll say it again, you do not have to talk about all of the things on this list, but you will probably talk about at least one or maybe two of these things on this list, perhaps more. So let's get into this. What do the prophets do? First, they call for the worship of Yahweh alone. This is a big thing. Lots of prophets do this in the Old Testament. They tell the Israelites, stop worshiping foreign gods, worship Yahweh alone. Pretty simple and straightforward stuff. Now the second bullet point is we need to get into a little bit more. They function as the moral conscience for the people of God. If you go back to a lesson or two ago from when we talked about the prophet Elijah, we saw that Elijah challenged Ahab, the king, over the issue of his illegal takeover of Naboth's land. And Elijah was there to basically say to the king, what you have done is wrong. Elijah was functioning as the moral conscience for the people of God, there to remind Ahab that what he had done was what he had done was wrong. And so the prophets are going to frequently call attention to the things that the Israelites are doing that is wrong, that is inconsistent with the will of God, or more specifically with the covenant that they have made with God. And when they do that, they're often going to call attention to injustices in society. And when they call attention to injustices in society, often they will talk about the widows and the orphans. Now, when the prophets use the term widows and orphans, they do not mean simply or literally widows and orphans. What they are referring to are anybody in society who is voiceless, oppressed, is being wronged in some way, is being harmed by the structure of society. Now, in ancient Israelite society, it just so happened that the most vulnerable people, the people who most frequently were harmed and needed somebody to speak up for them, tended to be the widows and the orphans. Why? Because these folks do not have an adult male in their lives to speak for them and take care of them. But a widow and an orphan, but the widows and orphans do not have to be just widows and orphans. The widows and the orphans can be anybody who is being harmed by society. So if you were to think about this in perhaps more modern terms, are widows and orphans if you catch what I'm saying here? Yes, oftentimes they are. Especially orphans. They need people to speak up for them, to take care of them. Some widows today, though, if they've been fortunate enough that they have life insurance policies, if they've been very good savers, they may be in a situation where they are already provided for and they are not necessarily widows and orphans in the sense that they need somebody to protect them. They may have been able to protect themselves already as a result of the way society works. But there are people in society today who may be widows and orphans who are not literal widows or literal orphans. Oftentimes today, members of people who are racial minorities, those folks oftentimes are oppressed sometimes. They are often taken advantage of. Immigrants, be they legal or illegal / undocumented, those folks are oftentimes taken advantage of today in society, and so they would count as widows and orphans. So the prophets are going to call for the worship of Yahweh alone, and they're also going to function as the moral conscience of the people by speaking out for speaking against the injustices in society, especially the structural injustices in society. Now, the last thing that they're going to do is they will sometimes predict the future. We need to understand the nature of their predictions, though. First, when they make a prediction about the future, most of the time, their predictions about the future are something that is going to happen in the near future. Think about Elijah again. He said that if Naboth did not return the land to, if Ahab did not return the land to Naboth's relatives, then Ahab, when he dies, his body will be eaten by dogs. That's something that will happen soon, relatively soon, within the lifetime of the prophet or very shortly after the life of the prophet is over. And the reason why the prophets make predictions that are going to happen in the near future is so that people will know that they are speaking the truth. If you make a wild prediction about something that's going to happen 600 years in the future, nobody really cares about that because nobody's going to be around to see it come true one way or another. And by the time it does or doesn't come true, you're probably going to be long forgotten and nobody's going to care what you said. But if you make a prediction that comes true soon, then people will say, aha, this person seems to have some insight into the things of God. God seems to be informing them of things that they're not necessarily supposed to know about. Maybe we should pay more attention to this person. And so the predictions of the future are oftentimes about proving that the prophet is from God. But we also need to note that a lot of the predictions of the prophets do not necessarily come true. Was Ahab's body eaten by dogs? As far as we know, according to the Deuteronomistic history, no, it wasn't. That's because Elijah made an if-then prediction. He said, if you don't return the land, then your body will be eaten by dogs. Because Ahab does return the land, then the rest of the prediction does not have to come true. So a lot of the prophetic predictions are if-then in nature. They do not absolutely have to come true. Instead, what they're doing is they're saying, if you don't stop oppressing the widows and the orphans of society, if you don't stop worshiping foreign gods, then God is going to punish you. Now, those kinds of predictions do come true because the Israelites don't stop worshiping foreign gods and don't stop oppressing the widows and the orphans. But just because a prophet says something doesn't mean it has to come true as long as they give it that if-then component. Now, most of the prophetic predictions are doom and gloom type of stuff, but they also sometimes will predict hope, and we'll hit on that in some later lessons. So to briefly wrap up, what is a prophet? One who speaks for God. What does it mean to speak for God? Usually what they're going to do is they're going to call for the worship of Yahweh alone, and they're going to be the kinds of people who speak out against the injustices of society. And the term they will use is widows and orphans, and a widow and an orphan is basically anybody who is oppressed or needs somebody to speak up for them. All right, now that you've listened to this, now you can do the assignment, and hopefully you'll have a good understanding of what is a prophet as a result of listening to this lecture and finishing the assignment.